Special thanks to Attilio Bolsoni and his fabulous book, The Boss of Bosses, the life of the infamous Toto Riina, dreaded head of the Sicilian Mafia, from which a lot of the research for this documentary was taken. This is the story of a man who committed mass murder and in doing so, created other monsters to carry out those murders for him. Salvatore Riina rose up through the ranks to become the boss of the Sicilian Mafia and managed the organization when it was at the height of its power. Under his direction, Cosa Nostra had a portfolio of crimes that included heroin trafficking to the United States, blackmail, and political assassination. Riina also ordered dozens of deaths along the way, most of them perpetrated by his right-hand man, Giovanni Brusca, who Riina turned into a killing machine in his efforts to become the boss of bosses. Nicknamed the Beast, Riina's savagery turned out to be his downfall, as mobsters broke the code of omertà to testify against their former boss. After more than 20 years as a fugitive, Riina was finally arrested in 1993. When he died on the prison ward of a hospital in northern Italy, he was serving 26 life sentences for murders committed over a 23-year period. In 1924, Benito Mussolini launched his effort to crush the Mafia and establish fascist rule over Sicily. His authority on the island was threatened and weakened by the Mafia, so a successful campaign to destroy the organization would bolster his position as new leader. Prefect of Palermo, Cesare Mori was given the job of destroying Mafia influence on the island. By 1929, Mussolini declared that fascism had overwhelmingly freed Sicily from the grip of Cosa Nostra. But many of the sentences handed down to mafioso were for 5 years or less, and by the time that Salvatore Riina was born in 1930, many of those men were returning from exile and prison and reforming their crime family network across Sicily. Not least because many Mafia members had been implanted into high-profile positions at both provincial and state level. They were the mayors, the doctors and shopkeepers. Behind the facade of professional occupations, these men were quietly helping to rebuild and reorganize the Mafia structure. The afternoon of Saturday, the 11th of September, was warm and sunny. The summer had been unusually hot, even by Sicily's standards, and for 6 months now, the Baticano River had remained dry. Giovanni Riina and his 3 young sons trudged across the scorched fields on their way back to their humble home in the village of Corleone. The youngest boy, Francesco, had the honor of sitting on top of the family's mule, while Gaetano and Salvatore, known as Toto, the eldest boy, walked beside their father Giovanni. The family were poor peasants, like many others on the island. Giovanni had inherited a little land from his father, almost 3 hectares in fact, and that produced enough food to keep the family from starving. Times were hard though, especially now in the middle of a war. For months, the lightning planes of the Allied forces had been dropping their bombs on Sicily before the invasion took place in July. And as the Riina family plodded through the fields at Vener de Poggio that afternoon, they came across one of those bombs, glinting in the sunshine. Beside it lay a broken cannon shell, discarded by the Germans when they fled the area. Known by the Royal Carabinieri as a subject capable of doing damage to people and the property of others, Giovanni Riina had to have them. They would provide precious gunpowder for the sawn-off Scopetta's bullets and iron for farming implements. Francesco was told to get down from the mule so that his father and Toto could load the American bomb and the cannon shell onto the animal's back. With great delicacy, they lifted their booty and set off for home. It was an hour before they reached Corleone. It was 6 o'clock, and many of the village children were still playing out around Piazza Soprano as the Riinas made their way to Via Rua del Piano and their 2-roomed home. By then it was around 7 o'clock, but still light, when Giovanni unloaded the bomb to defuse it there in the alley by the side of the house. Toto and Francesco stood nearby to watch their father, while Gaetano sat on a wall near to the mule, As Giovanni inspected the shell, it appeared to be empty, save for a tiny amount of gunpowder. Then it slipped from his hands. The explosion disemboweled Giovanni, who died alongside his youngest son Francesco and the mule. Gaetano took shrapnel to the right leg and neck. It also shredded his cheeks. 2 days later, Riina's heavily pregnant widow Maria attended the funeral of her husband and youngest son along with her 2 daughters. Gaetano, who by some miracle had survived the blast, was still in hospital. At 13 years old, Salvatore Totò had become head of the Riina family. Later, it was said that the burial of his father and brother was the last time that anyone saw him cry. The family continued on in poverty. Totò worked in the fields from dawn till dusk every day. With his mother to support and 3 sisters and a younger brother to feed, life was hard. Riina was recruited into the Mafia by Don Michele Navarra, who was doing very well for himself in the village of Corleone. In 1946, Navarra became the director of the hospital after his predecessor was conveniently murdered. Along with about 20 other young men, all chosen for their predisposition towards violence and cruelty, Riina went around raiding farms and stealing livestock. It was the beginning of the Corleonesi, a gang that would eventually rule Palermo, Sicily, and Cosa Nostra. The 3 mafiosi, Toto Riina, Calogero Bagarella, and Bernardo Provenzano were always together. But it was Riina who was the smartest, the cruel one, with his black eyes who would study, intimidate, and frighten. In March of 1948, Placido Rizzotto, the secretary of the Corleone Trade Union, went missing, and in Corleone, missing meant dead. The socialist leader was involved in activism with farm laborers, trying to help them take over unfarmed land on large estates on the island. It was the first time that Toto Riina was known to have taken part in a major crime, when along with another mafioso named Luciano Leggio, he had kidnapped, murdered, and dumped Placido's body in a nearby sinkhole. Everyone knew that Rizzotto was dead, and they all knew who was involved. One brave witness even sent an anonymous letter to the police, naming names. It was the only type of correspondence that a Sicilian could have with the authorities. But the man who represented the law in Corleone just happened to be cousin of Michele Navarra, the Mafia boss. It would be another 60 years before Rizzotto's body was discovered on a cliff top near Corleone. He was given a state funeral in 2012. A year later, the 19-year-old Riina was in prison for the murder of Domenico Di Matteo, a local boy from the village. He and Riina had exchanged blows a couple of times, Riina spurred on by his friends and Di Matteo by his cousins. Only this time, revolvers were drawn. Riina was shot in both legs by a single bullet passing first through the right calf and then through the left. Di Matteo was shot too, only he was not so lucky and died the same evening. There was some argument as to who had drawn first. Riina said he had fired in self-defense, but the jury didn't believe him. He was sentenced to 12 years and 4 months in prison. Riina was released after serving just half of his time and returned home to find his friends Bagarella and Provenzano waiting for him, and saw that under the leadership of Don Navarra, the Corleonesi was becoming powerful. Navarra had been arrested for his part in the murder of Giuseppe Letizia, an 11-year-old shepherd. Giuseppe had witnessed the kidnapping of Placido Rizzotto. When Navarra gave an injection to the boy, he later died and the press blamed Navarra for eliminating a witness. Arrested but not convicted, Navarra was sent into exile to Calabria for 5 years, but he was able to return to Sicily in 1949, thanks to his political connections. A sheep and cattle breeding ranch was set up on the Piano della Scala estate in 1957. It was Luciano Leggio who collected rents from the farmers in the area, and consequently, there were 153 mafia-related murders in Corleone between the years 1953 to 58. Leggio was in business with Riina's uncle Giacomo. The two families wanted to build a large dam on the Balis River near Della Scala to irrigate the area. However, Don Navarro wanted to control the water supply and resented the plan. The springs in Sicily are private property, and their exploitation produced huge profits, an operation traditionally run by the Mafia. Relations between Navarro and the mafiosi he had tutored were now more than a little strained. So much so that Navarro ordered a hit on Leggio and any man who sided with him. The plot failed, and Leggio walked away with minor injuries. By the summer of 1958, Toto Riina, now 28 years old, was out of prison. The details of his initiation ceremony, or who was present at it, remain a mystery. What is known is that Riina was already a killer, and more importantly, he could murder and keep his mouth shut, two skills highly regarded by the Mafia. The Corleonesi were obsessed with secrecy, and Riina was now a man of honor. Meanwhile, the American Mafia boss Joseph Bonanno had returned to Sicily to franchise his heroin operation to the Sicilian clans. Expecting rivalry between the families, he helped to establish the Sicilian Mafia Commission in order to mediate any disputes that might come up between the Palermo families. Along with another doctor, who just happened to be along for the ride, Michel Navarro was shot dead on the 2nd of August, 1958. Riddled with 92 bullets, another 124 cartridges were found on the ground beside the car. The ambush had taken place on an isolated country road. Word was there were at least 7 killers, 5 gunmen who opened up with automatic weapons, and 2 drivers with getaway cars. The most powerful Mafia boss of Corleone was dead, and the manhunt to find his killers was huge. But at the homes of the Riinas, the Leggios, the Provenzanos, and the Bagarellas, only women, children, and the elderly could be found. All the men, including Totò, were gone, hidden away in the safe houses amid the hills preparing for the war to come. It was over a month before the first shots were fired. Totò Riina met the 3 Marino brothers for a formal reconciliation in front of the San Rocco fortress. Negotiations with Navarro's former allies appeared to be going well, but it was all a ruse, as suddenly Bagarella and Provenzano walked out of the trees carrying sawn-off shotguns and mowed all 3 down. As more mafiosi came running, there was chaos, and bullets flew everywhere. By the time Riina ran off down one of the alleys, he was a wanted man. After killing the 80-year-old landowner Carmelo Lobue, who he shot in the back, and Vincenzo Cortemiglia, the rival gang's chief killer. Riina was the Leggio gang's most dangerous hitman and stated, "We must never leave jobs unfinished. Witnesses are always dangerous." It had gone on for 5 years, but finally, the fugitives had won their campaign, and dozens of Navarro's supporters had been killed. But it came at a price as the Corleonesi found themselves wanted men. It was Luciano Leggio who became the boss of the Corleone Mafia, and along with Riina, Provenzano, and Bagarella, they had taken not just the village, but the many hectares of land surrounding it. Now they were off to Sicily's capital, to Palermo, not only to stay off the radar, but also to introduce themselves to the families of Cosa Nostra, the Torretta, the Grecos, and the La Barbera brothers. In Palermo, Riina was just a humble foot soldier, but he had the intelligence, the calmness, and the patience to bide his time. Riina was the one who passed down orders from Leggio. He knew all about the deals that went on between his boss and the Palermo Mafia. His friends Bagarella and Provenzano remained simple gunmen, but the trio were still as thick as thieves. While Leggio trafficked in drugs with an Italian-American named Frank Three Fingers, indulged in beautiful women, stayed in expensive hotels in Milan and Rome, and got his photograph in the newspapers, Riina and his friends preferred the simple life. For them, it was about getting the job done inconspicuously, efficiently, and quietly. In 1962, a drug shipment to the United States was organized by Sicilian Mafia boss Cesare Manzilla. 2 other clans went on board with the deal, the Grecos and the La Barberas. The job of handling the heroin was given to another boss named Calcedonio di Pisa. However, when the drug shipment arrived in America, the American buyers claimed that an amount of heroin was missing, so they paid di Pisa a relatively lower sum of money. Di Pisa accused the Americans of cheating him, while the La Barberas believed Di Pisa had tried to double-cross them and had stolen the missing heroin for himself. Summoned to appear before the Sicilian Mafia Commission, Di Pisa was able to convince the council of his innocence, causing outrage in the La Barberas camp. Despite the fact that Di Pisa was a boss in his own right and therefore a member of the commission himself, he was murdered in December of 1962 when he was shot by 3 men using sawn-off shotguns while walking in a piazza in Palermo. Not one witness could recall hearing any gunshots when they were later questioned by the police. The La Barberas were blamed for the assassination which triggered the first Mafia war, a war in which many civilians were killed in the crossfire. In April and May of 1963, several onlookers were wounded during Mafia shootings in Palermo. Boss, Angelo La Barbera, was lucky to survive an assassination attempt in Milan. In June, a car bomb exploded in Ciaculli, an outlying suburb of Palermo. 6 military officers and a policeman were killed while trying to defuse the bomb. It was intended for the head of the Sicilian Mafia Commission, Salvatore Greco. It wasn't until 1984 that the truth about the missing heroin came to light, when Tommaso Buscetta became one of the first members of the Sicilian Mafia to break the code of omertà and turn informant, explaining the inner workings of the organization to the authorities. Buscetta said that it was Michel, the Cobra Cavataio, who had killed Di Pisa. The mob boss had lost out on business dealings because of the La Barberas, so he killed Di Pisa, knowing that the Grecos would be blamed and a war would be started. Cavataio continued to fuel the war through further murders and bombing attacks. The Corleonesi very wisely stayed out of the conflict while the Mafia destroyed itself. But the state had had enough, and the war that had begun as Mafia family against family became a war of the Mafia against the authorities. There was a huge crackdown, roundups and searches. Almost 2,000 arrests were made. The Sicilian clans disbanded and went into hiding, some escaping abroad to avoid arrest. The Sicilian Mafia Commission was dissolved and didn't reform until 1969. The impact on the businesses of the Mafia families was immense. Many found themselves in poverty because of the cost of legal fees and a lack of income. One of the captured men wanted for murders, committed between September 1958 and July 1962, along with Bernardo Provenzano, Calogero Bagarella, and other persons unknown, was none other than the 33-year-old Toto Riina. His 2 friends were still free and able to run the family while he was absent, but Riina, along with Leggio, awaited their trials at the Ucciardone prison in Palermo. After several months on remand, the trials of the 114th Old and New Mafiosi took place at the Palace of Justice, and in the end there was a very long list of acquittals, thanks to a lot of witness and juror intimidation and evidence tampering. On his release, Riina found that he soon became a fugitive again as he was indicted on a further murder charge and remained on the run for another 23 years. With the trials out of the way, the Mafia could now get back to work, so the Sicilian Mafia Commission was re-established in 1970. It was ruled by 3 heads, Gaetano Badalmenti, Stefano Bontare, and Corleonesi boss Luciano Leggio. Normal illicit activities ensued while Leggio initiated a campaign to dominate Cosa Nostra and its links to the US drug trade. It appeared that both the Mafia and the country were subject to the will of the Corleonesi. In 1992, Leonardo Narduzzo Messina was a former Sicilian mafiosi who became a government informant, or pentito. He described how the Corleonesi organized their rise to power. They took power by slowly killing everyone. We were kind of infatuated with them because we thought that getting rid of the old bosses, we would become the new bosses. Some people killed their brother, others their cousin, and so on, because they thought they would take their places. Instead, slowly, they gained control of the whole system. First, they used us to get rid of the old bosses. Then, they got rid of all those who raised their heads. All that's left are men without character who are their puppets. In 1971, Leggio, with another arrest warrant hanging over his head, moved to the city of Milan on the mainland. He wasn't alone there either. Almost 400 mafiosi ran their operations between Milan and Sicily over the 10-year period from 61 to 71. From his hiding place in Milan, Leggio ran the business through Provenzano and Riina. During a meeting between the three men, Leggio made the decision to appoint Riina as his deputy to intercede on his behalf when he was unable to attend meetings with the commission. In December of 1970, he was convicted in absentia of murdering Don Michele Navarra back in 1958 and given a life sentence. The law finally caught up with Leggio in May of 1974. Arrested at his apartment in his pajamas, the most feared man in Italy surrendered peacefully. Later, the informant Buscetta would testify that it was Riina who betrayed his boss to gain control of the Corleonesi. Whatever the truth was, Leggio was imprisoned, and Riina became head of the family. The Corleonesi began to win over allies among the other mafia families, aligning themselves with powerful Palermo bosses Giuseppe Calò, Filippo Marchese, and Rosario Riccobono. Riina also had a close association with the 'Ndrangheta, the mafia-type crime syndicate that ran the Calabria region in southern Italy. It was Domenico Don Mico Tripodo, the highly respected, powerful, and charismatic 'Ndrangheta boss, who was Riina's compare d'anello, a sort of best man and trusted friend at his 1974 wedding. Giovanni the Pig Brusca committed his first mafia murder when he was 18 years old. His father, Bernardo, had been part of the Corleonesi since the old days and was the head of his village when his son was initiated into the family. Giovanni had already committed 2 murders and numerous criminal deeds, so he was more than welcomed by the boss of the Corleonesi, Toto Riina, who attended the ceremony in 1976. The Corleonesi's primary rivals in Palermo were Stefano Bontade, Salvatore Inzerillo, and Tano Badalamenti, who, in 1978, Riina was able to have expelled from the commission because of his involvement in the assassination of boss Francesco Madonia, a Corleonesi ally. Badalamenti was subsequently exiled not just from the Mafia, but also from Sicily. Riina also arranged for the murders of Giuseppe Di Cristina and Giuseppe Calderoni in 1978, bosses of the Sicilian clans in Catania and Riesi. Both men were allied with Bontade and Inzerillo. Their replacements were followers of Riina. Over a short period of time, Riina had managed to isolate the bosses of Palermo and their men. The Second Mafia War raged on for 3 years from 1981 to 1984. Cutting across clan divisions, Riina secretly formed alliances with different mafiosi families, ignoring the rules about loyalty among Cosa Nostra. But it was a war on 2 fronts. As the Corleonesi slaughtered the ruling families of the Palermo Mafia, they were, at the same time, using the interfamily group to wage a war of intimidation against law enforcement and the Italian authorities to prevent any successful investigations and prosecutions. The morphine was refined on Sicily. Between the years of 79 and 80, Bontade and Inzerillo then sold the heroin to the Gambinos for $50,000 a kilo, making their cut around $35 million. The Gambinos sold it to the other American families for $130,000 a kilo, making their cut around somewhere between $78 and $91 million. Everyone was a winner, except Salvatore Riina, who was only allowed to dip his toe into the stream of money. But all that was going to come to an abrupt end. It began on an April evening in 1981. Stefano the Falcon Bontade was returning home to change. Driving his Alfa Romeo Giulietta, he was killed by the Corleonesi hitman riding pillion on the back of a Honda motorcycle. As the bike pulled up alongside the car, the gunman opened fire, and the 3 blasts hit Bontade in the face. In May of 1981, just a few weeks after the murder of Bontade, Salvatore Inzerillo was leaving his girlfriend's apartment block when a hitman burst out of the van that was parked nearby. Before Inzerillo could reach the safety of his armored Alfetta car, he was gunned down in the street. Inzerillo had arranged the assassination of Judge Gaetano Costa a year earlier. Costa had signed an arrest warrant against the Spatola Inzerillo Gambino clan and their heroin trafficking network. Costa was killed in August by another motorcycle hitman, which seemed to be the getaway vehicle of choice. Now it was the turn of the murdered pair's relatives and associates. Inzarido's teenage son vowed to avenge his father's death, so Riina had him brutally tortured and killed. In September, another close ally of Inzerillo and Bontad named Calogero Pizzuta was sitting among innocent bystanders when he was shot dead in a crowded bar. It became known as the Time of 1,000 Murders, Matanza, or just simply the Slaughter, and hundreds of mobsters as well as anyone that posed a threat to Riina's rise was eliminated. Riina thought there were too many districts, too many families, too many bosses. 24 Palermo families was far too many. There should be just 5, and the bosses should be chosen by the commission, not by the other families, he said. Anyone who opposed his rise was murdered. He also took the Sicilian Mafia from a democracy to a dictatorship within 2 years, beginning a campaign to systematically assassinate any anti-mafia activist as he saw fit. No one was off limits, whether they were police, politicians, criminal prosecutors, or judges. Riina even began to eliminate Corleonesi allies, such as Filippo Marchese, who ran the Room of Death, a small apartment where mafiosi, who stood in the way of the Corleonesi, were taken to be garroted by men such as Giovanni Brusca. Marchese was strangled to death at a warehouse, his body dissolved in acid like so many of his victims. Or Pino Creco, who carried out dozens of murders for Riina, possibly as many as 300, who was shot to death by 2 of his fellow mafiosi and supposed friends. In the end, Riina was ruling the Mafia. After the disappearance of both of his sons, followed by the deaths of his brother, son-in-law, brother-in-law, and 4 of his nephews, Tommaso Buscetta was more than a little disillusioned with the Mafia lifestyle that he had chosen. The youngest of 17 children, Buscetta had grown up in crippling poverty and began cigarette smuggling for the Mafia in his early teens. An ally of Stefano Bontade, Buscetta fled to Brazil in the middle of the slaughter. After his arrest in Brazil and extradition to Italy in 1984, Buscetta asked to speak to the anti-mafia judge, Giovanni Falcone. He spoke to Falcone for over a month about the inner workings and the graded structure of Cosa Nostra. Buscetta talked about the initiation rituals and the Sicilian Mafia Commission and was placed into witness protection and given American citizenship and a new identity from the government. He testified against Gaetano Badalamenti and other Sicilian American mafiosi accused of drug trafficking in the Pizza Connection trial in New York in 1985. In Sicily, he testified at the Maxi trial, the largest trial in history, against the Mafia, which went on for 6 years. Because of the information given to Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, the prosecutors were able to indict 475 Mafia members and convict 338. It was a blow that Riina was not going to take lying down. Within 2 months, both Falcone and Borsellino were dead. At the Maxi trial, Riina was given 2 life sentences in his absence. Hoping for a lengthy appeal process, he stopped the campaign of murders against officials while the case went to the higher court. But the Supreme Court upheld the convictions. Riina wanted to demonstrate that the Mafia still held power in Sicily, despite the outcome of the Maxi trial. He gave the job of killing Falcone to Brusca. In May of 1992, Brusca detonated the car bomb that killed not just the judge, but also his wife, Francesca, and 3 police officers in the Capaci bombing on Highway 29 outside of Palermo. Just 2 months later, in July, Borsellino was killed at the entrance to his mother's house in Palermo by another car bomb. The attack also claimed the lives of 5 police officers. But the killings of Borsellino and Falcone were the biggest mistakes that Riina could make. There was a public outcry and condemnation, not just for the Mafia, but also for the politicians who they felt had failed to adequately protect the 2 anti-Mafia prosecutors. In response, the Italian government began a major crackdown against the Mafia. And finally, after spending almost 25 years on the run, Riina was captured in 1993, but even incarceration didn't stop him from arranging more murders after 3 of the men involved in Falcone's murder were soon arrested by the anti-mafia team. Santino Di Matteo turned informant, but Riina ordered Brusca to kidnap his 12-year-old son Giuseppe to stop Di Matteo from talking. After over 2 years of mistreatment and torture, the boy was finally strangled, stripped, and dissolved in acid. Brusca had no regrets, stating that by the time he died, Giuseppe was no longer a boy. Despite this, Di Matteo continued to cooperate with the law. When Brusca was finally arrested in 1996, he did the unthinkable. He too broke the code of omertà, became a pentito, and gave evidence against his boss Riina and the entire Mafia organization. He was sentenced to 26 years in prison for the Falcone bombing in 1997, and another 30 years for Giuseppe's murder 2 years later. In 2021, because of his good behavior and cooperation with the authorities, Brusca was discharged on parole for 4 years. Despite the public outcry at his release, Brusca remains a free man. Riina was given 26 life sentences and was believed to have ordered more than 150 murders, many of them carried out by his right-hand man, Giovanni Brusca, who talks about some of the tortures and murders in his memoirs. Diagnosed with kidney cancer as well as suffering from Parkinson's disease and a heart condition, Riina was put into a medically induced coma in 2017. He died in the prison unit of Maggiore Hospital in Parma, northern Italy. He was 87 years old. His family were given special permission to visit. Riina had limited contact with the outside world to prevent him from running the organization from prison. It was in fact Provenzano who was to take over as boss of the Sicilian Mafia until his own arrest near Corleone in 2006. He died in prison in 2016 after being given 20 life sentences. In his ultimate goal to be the boss of all bosses, Riina's cruelty had seen him rise to great heights in the Sicilian Mafia, but it had also led to his downfall. Salvatore, the Beast Riina, was described by the Italian journalist Francesco Bongara as the fiercest and the nastiest mobster in the Mafia, probably in history,